Selma never meant to stop in Fallow Ridge. It was a boil on the backside of the prairie, a place you passed through with your eyes forward and your hand on your purse. She was just trying to get to the plot of land her late husband had left her, a final chapter in a book she was desperate to close. Her wagon, the one she'd bought with what little pension money his brothers hadn't clawed back, was her whole world now. The horse was old, the wheels were worn, and her hope was running just as thin. And then, of course, the wheel snapped. It cracked like a gunshot right in front of the saloon. The wagon lurched, dumping a crate of preserves onto the dusty street. Laughter spilled out of the saloon doors, ugly and sharp. Not a single man moved to help. They just leaned in the doorways, spitting tobacco juice and grinning, watching the lone woman wrestle with the dead weight of her life. Selma's hands were raw, her spirit was frayed, but she didn't cry. She didn't give them the satisfaction. It was in that moment of quiet, stubborn fury that she saw it. In the center of the town square, baking under the merciless sun, was a cage. Not a holding cell attached to the sheriff's office, but a freestanding iron box, like something for a carnival animal. The bars were rusted, the floor was caked in filth and scattered straw, and inside, there was a man. He was slumped against the bars, head bowed, a curtain of matted hair hiding his face. His shirt was torn to ribbons, his feet were bare and crusted with mud, and his wrists were bound with what looked like strips of a saddle blanket. He was utterly still. He didn't react to the heat, the flies, or the jeering of the children who circled the cage like vultures. Someone had nailed a crude sign to the bars. $10 to touch the beast. As if on cue, a boy no older than 10 picked up a rock and hurled it at the cage. It clanged against the iron, inches from the man's head. He didn't even flinch. It was like he wasn't there at all. Selma forgot about her broken wagon. She forgot about the laughing men and the spilled preserves. She felt a pull, a strange and powerful current dragging her toward the spectacle. She walked slowly, her boots kicking up little puffs of dust. The crowd of locals parted for her, their taunts dying in their throats, replaced by a murmur of curiosity. Who was this woman? What did she want? The sheriff was leaning against a post, whittling a piece of wood, the picture of bored authority. He watched her approach from under the brim of his hat. "What's he done?" Selma's voice was quiet, but it cut through the afternoon heat. The sheriff didn't bother to stand. He just spit a stream of brown juice near her feet. "Nothing we can prove," he drawled, his eyes glinting with amusement. "Wandered out of the hills a week ago, carrying another man's saddlebag and bleeding from a cut on his head. Won't say a word, not his name, not where he came from, nothing." The sheriff gestured with his knife towards the cage. "Since he can't account for himself, we figured we'd let the folks make some use of him. A little entertainment breaks the monotony." "Is he dangerous?" she asked, her gaze fixed on the still figure. The sheriff let out a short, ugly laugh. "Only to someone who doesn't know their place. A woman like you ought to stay clear." And that's when it happened. The man in the cage lifted his head. Not all the way, just enough for Selma to see his eyes. They weren't wild or crazed like she expected. They weren't begging for pity. They were just watching. There was an intelligence there, a deep and unnerving stillness, like a man who had seen the end of the world and was no longer impressed by its smaller cruelties. He was looking right at her. Something shifted inside Selma. A lock she didn't even know was there suddenly clicked open. She stepped forward, right to the edge of the cage, until the tips of her boots were inches from the bars. The town went silent. The only sound was the wind and the soft scraping of the sheriff's knife against wood. "Does he have a name?" she asked, her voice stronger now. "If he does, he ain't sharing it," the sheriff grunted. "We just call him the Beast." The man's eyes never left hers. It was a challenge, a question, a dare. Selma's hand went to the small leather pouch tied to her belt. Inside, nestled in with a few coins, was the last thing of value she owned in the world. The one thing she had sworn she would never part with, her wedding ring, a thin band of gold worn smooth by years of love and labor, a relic of a man who went to war and never came back, leaving her with nothing but a worthless piece of paper for a distant homestead and a heart full of ghosts. She had told herself she would die with that ring on her finger. Until now, with the whole town watching, she reached into the pouch, her fingers closing around the cool, familiar metal. She pulled it out. It gleamed in the harsh sunlight, a tiny star of defiance. She walked straight to the sheriff and held it up between her thumb and forefinger. The crowd gasped. The sheriff stopped whittling. "Will this," Selma said, her voice ringing with a clarity that surprised even herself, "buy whatever he is?" The sheriff squinted at the ring, his lip curling into a sneer. He took it from her, weighing it in his palm like he was judging livestock. "Ain't worth $10, he said, though his eyes told a different story. He'd seen something. A flicker of greed? Recognition? She couldn't be sure. He held it up to the light. "But," he chuckled, "it'll make for a fine story to tell." The crowd tittered, unsure if this was a joke or a transaction. Selma didn't blink. She just stood her ground, her back straight as a fence post. With a dramatic sigh, the sheriff pocketed her past and pulled a large, rusted key from his belt. He ambled over to the cage and jammed the key into the lock. It turned with a tortured screech, a sound of metal surrendering. He swung the door open. It groaned on its hinges and hung ajar. "He's all yours, ma'am," the sheriff called out, a mocking edge to his voice. "Hope you brought a strong rope and a healthy supply of regrets." Selma ignored him. She ignored the shocked faces of the townsfolk. She walked to the open cage door and stopped. The man hadn't moved. He was still sitting there, head bowed again as if nothing had changed. "You can come, or you can stay," Selma said to him, her voice low and steady. "But either way, that door is open. You don't belong to them anymore." For a long moment, there was nothing. The wind blew dust across the square. A dog barked somewhere in the distance. Selma wondered if she'd just traded the memory of her husband for a broken man who couldn't even stand. Then, slowly, he began to move. He pushed himself forward, bracing his hands on his knees. His legs were stiff, his movements agonizingly slow, as if his joints had rusted shut. He rose to his feet, unfolding himself until he was standing tall. He was much taller than she'd expected, broad-shouldered beneath the tattered shirt. When he stepped out of the cage and into the full sunlight, the crowd took an involuntary step back. His hair was a dark, tangled mess, his beard thick and unkempt. But his face, it wasn't the face of a beast. It was the face of a man who had been hammered by hardship, but hadn't shattered. His eyes, shadowed and unreadable, swept over the crowd not with fear, but with a cold, assessing calm. He didn't say a word. He just walked. The crowd parted for him like the Red Sea. Selma fell into step beside him, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. She felt their eyes on her back, burning with judgment and disbelief. She didn't care. She walked to her wagon, climbed into the driver's seat, and picked up the reins. She expected him to climb into the back, to huddle amongst the supplies like cargo. He didn't. He walked to the front of the wagon, right beside her. He looked down at the broken wheel, then at the road ahead. Then he looked at her. It wasn't a look of gratitude. It was a look of appraisal, of command. He held out his hand, not asking for the reins, but taking them. Selma was so stunned, she just handed them over. He climbed up into the driver's seat, settling into the space as if he'd been born there. He gave the reins a single expert flick. The old horse, which had barely listened to Selma for 1,000 miles, responded instantly, pulling the wagon forward on 3 good wheels, the broken ones scraping and groaning against the dirt. As they pulled away from the gawking crowd and the empty cage, Selma sat beside him in stunned silence. She had thought she was setting a man free, but as he guided the horse with a confidence she hadn't felt in years, a terrifying thought crossed her mind. She hadn't bought a broken animal. She had just handed the reins of her life to a complete stranger. and she had no idea where he was taking her. The town of Fallow Ridge vanished behind them, a bad memory swallowed by the dust. The man, her silent companion, handled the horse and the limping wagon with an unnerving competence. He didn't seem bothered by the screech of the broken wheel or the setting sun. He just drove, his eyes fixed on the horizon, his jaw set. Selma's mind was racing. Who was this man? The sheriff said he'd wandered out of the hills, but he held the reins like a seasoned teamster. He sat with a straight-backed posture that spoke of discipline, not madness. Nothing about him fit the story she'd been sold. When the last light faded from the sky, he pulled the wagon off the trail and into a small, sheltered hollow by a creek. Before Selma could even think to ask, he was off the wagon and moving with a quiet efficiency that was both impressive and deeply unsettling. He didn't ask for permission, he just acted. He unhitched the horse and led it to the water. He assessed the broken wheel with a practiced eye, propping it up with a large rock. Then he began to gather firewood. Not just random sticks, but specific types of dry, seasoned wood, which he broke into uniform lengths over his knee. By the time Selma had managed to climb down and pull out their meager supplies, a side of bacon and a bag of hardtack, he had a fire going. It wasn't a big, cheerful blaze. It was a small, tight, nearly smokeless fire, the kind a soldier would build to avoid being seen. The thought sent a shiver down her spine. She watched him from across the firelight, this man she had bought for a ring. He crouched by the flames, his back to a rock wall, his eyes constantly scanning the darkness around them. He was on watch, but what was he watching for? "Do you have a name?" she asked, the question feeling small and foolish in the vast silence. He glanced at her, his expression unreadable in the flickering light. He gave a single, almost imperceptible shake of his head. "Can you speak?" He paused, then gave a slow, deliberate nod. "But you won't," she finished for him. He offered a slight shrug, as if to say it was all the same. The gesture was more frustrating than 100 angry words. She was the one who had saved him, and yet he was the one in control, hoarding his secrets like a miser. She took a breath, trying to steady her nerves. "Look, I don't know who you are or what you've done. I bought you because what they were doing in that town was wrong. I'm not looking for a servant or a husband or a sob story. When we get this wheel fixed, you're free to go on your way. You don't owe me anything." He listened to her speech without a change in his expression. Then he did something that threw her completely off balance. He took the piece of hardtack he had set aside for himself, broke it cleanly in two, and held one half out to her across the fire. It wasn't a plea. It wasn't an apology. It was a simple, straightforward gesture, an acknowledgement, a partnership. Selma took the offered piece, their fingers brushing for a fraction of a second. His skin was rough, calloused, but there was a strange warmth to it. As she chewed the dry biscuit, she studied him again. She noticed the saddlebag the sheriff had mentioned. It was sitting beside him, close enough to touch. It was made of good leather, well oiled, with a silver buckle. It didn't look like something a vagrant would own. And there was something else. Sticking out of the top of his boot was the handle of a knife. The handle wasn't rough-hewn wood. It was polished bone, intricately carved. A gentleman's knife, or a killer's. Later that night, Selma lay wrapped in her blanket on one side of the fire, pretending to sleep. He sat on the other side, unmoving, a silent sentinel. She was exhausted, but sleep wouldn't come. Her mind kept replaying the scene in the town square, the sheriff's greedy eyes as he took her ring, the man's strange, commanding presence. She thought he was asleep, or at least resting. But then she saw him move. He thought she was asleep. He reached for the leather saddlebag, his movements furtive and quick. He pulled the flap open just a crack and peered inside. It was too dark to see what he was looking at, but she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he shielded the opening with his body. He pulled something out. It was small, wrapped in oilskin. He unwrapped it carefully, his back to her. He held it in his palm for a long moment, staring down at it like it was the most important thing in the world. Then, just as quickly, he wrapped it back up, tucked it deep inside the bag, and cinched it shut. He resumed his watch, as still as a statue. Selma's heart was hammering. What was he hiding? What was in that bag that he guarded so closely? The sheriff had made it sound like he'd stolen it. Maybe he had. Maybe she hadn't freed an innocent man. Maybe she'd just unleashed something far more dangerous. The silence of the wilderness no longer felt peaceful. It felt menacing. Every snap of a twig, every hoot of an owl, made her jump. She was alone out here with a man who was a complete mystery, a man who built smokeless fires and carried expensive knives, and guarded a secret in a stolen saddlebag. She had traded her past for him, and she was beginning to fear she had no future. The next morning, she woke to the smell of something cooking. The man was crouched by the fire, roasting a rabbit on a spit. He'd already skinned and cleaned it. A line of snares she hadn't even noticed him set was visible near the creek. He had worked while she slept, providing for them with a silent, ruthless efficiency. He offered her a piece of the roasted meat on the tip of his knife. She took it, her apprehension warring with her hunger. As they ate, she noticed he was working on the broken wheel. He had found a sturdy branch of ironwood and was carving it with his bone-handled knife, shaping it into a splint. His hands were steady, precise. Every cut was economical and sure. These were not the hands of a simple drifter. They traveled for 3 days in that strange, tense silence. He drove, he hunted, he fixed the wagon wheel with a combination of scavenged wood and strips of leather that held surprisingly well. He never spoke, but his actions were a language all their own. He was capable, resourceful, and deeply, deeply secretive. Selma found herself watching his every move, trying to piece together the puzzle of who he was. He moved like a predator, with a grace and awareness of his surroundings that was unnerving. When a rattlesnake slithered across the trail, he didn't panic. He simply stopped the horse, his body going utterly still, and waited for it to pass with a patience that seemed almost inhuman. She tried to make conversation, to chip away at the wall of his silence. She told him about her late husband, about the homestead she was traveling to, about her life before it had all fallen apart. She talked to fill the quiet, to make him seem less like a ghost and more like a man. He would listen, she thought, sometimes tilting his head as if considering her words. But he never offered anything in return. The saddlebag was his constant companion. He never let it out of his sight. When they made camp, it was always beside him. When he went to the creek to wash, he took it with him. Whatever was inside was his anchor, his secret heart. On the 4th night, they made camp in the shadow of a high, rocky mesa. A storm was brewing on the horizon, the air thick and heavy. As he built the fire, Selma decided she couldn't take the not knowing anymore. "That bag," she said, her voice sharp. "The sheriff said you were carrying it when they found you. He said it belonged to another man." He paused, a piece of kindling in his hand. He didn't look at her. "Did you steal it?" she pressed. "Is that why they put you in that cage? Are you a thief?" He slowly placed the kindling on the fire and finally turned to face her. His eyes were dark, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something raw in their depths. Pain, anger. He gave a sharp, definitive shake of his head. "No." "Then whose is it?" she demanded. "What's inside it that's so important you guard it like it's your own soul?" He stared at her, his jaw working. She could see the conflict in him, the desperate urge to speak warring with whatever powerful force kept him silent. He opened his mouth as if to try, but only a choked, rasping sound came out. A look of pure agony crossed his face. He slammed his mouth shut, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. It was then that Selma understood. He wasn't choosing to be silent. He couldn't speak. Something was physically wrong, a wound hidden from sight. He saw the realization dawn on her face. The anger in his eyes softened, replaced by a profound weariness. He stood up, walked over to the smoothest patch of dirt near the fire, and crouched down. He picked up a burnt stick. His hands trembled slightly as he began to draw in the dirt. At first it was just lines, a confusing jumble. But then the image took shape. It was a building, a cabin. Then he drew flames, angry, jagged lines consuming the cabin. Beside it, he drew a stick figure, a man lying on the ground. Selma's breath caught in her throat. "There was a fire," she whispered. "You were in a fire." He nodded, his eyes fixed on the crude drawing. Then he added something else. He drew a second figure standing over the first, holding a torch. And then he drew one more thing, next to the standing figure. A star. A sheriff's badge. Selma stared at the drawing, her blood running cold. A fire. A dead man. And a sheriff. It wasn't just a random act of violence. It was an execution, and the law was on the wrong side. Before she could process the horrific story in the dirt, he quickly wiped it away with his hand, erasing the evidence. He looked up at her, his eyes pleading. He was trusting her with a truth that could get them both killed. Suddenly, a sound cut through the night, the unmistakable snap of a twig, too loud to be an animal. The man was on his feet in an instant. He didn't look scared, he looked ready. He kicked dirt over the fire, extinguishing the flames, plunging them into near-total darkness. He grabbed the saddlebag in one hand and Selma's arm in the other. His grip was like iron. "Get to the wagon," he whispered. The voice was a raw, mangled thing, like gravel being dragged over stone. It was the first word he had spoken, and it was a command born of pure terror. They weren't alone in the wilderness anymore. Someone had followed them, and they hadn't come for a friendly chat. The darkness was absolute. The man, her silent protector, pulled her behind the wagon, his body shielding hers. His breathing was steady, but she could feel the tension humming through him like a plucked wire. He held the bone-handled knife in his right hand, the blade gleaming faintly in the starlight. The saddlebag was slung over his shoulder. "Who is it?" Selma whispered, her voice trembling. He didn't answer. He just put a finger to his lips, his eyes scanning the impenetrable blackness of the trees that surrounded their small clearing. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating. All Selma could hear was the frantic beat of her own heart and the wind whispering through the pines. It sounded like it was telling secrets. Then, a voice called out, lazy and confident. "No need to hide in the dark, Marshall. We know you're there." "Marshall?" Selma's mind reeled. The drawing in the dirt, the star. This man wasn't a drifter or a thief. He was a lawman, or he had been. Two figures emerged from the trees, walking slowly into the clearing. Even in the gloom, Selma recognized them instantly. It was the sheriff of Fallow Ridge and his pimply-faced deputy. The sheriff wasn't whittling now. He was holding a rifle, and it was pointed right at them. "You've led us on quite a chase," the sheriff said, his voice dripping with false friendliness. He stopped about 20 feet away. "I have to admit I'm impressed. For a man who took a bullet to the throat, you're still pretty spry." A bullet to the throat, not just a fire. The raw, rasping sound of his voice suddenly made horrifying sense. "And you, ma'am," the sheriff said, turning his cold eyes on Selma. "I don't know what he told you, but you've gotten yourself mixed up in something that is way above your pay grade. You should have just kept on riding." "What do you want?" Selma asked, trying to keep her voice from shaking. "What I want," the sheriff sneered, "is what he's carrying in that bag. It belongs to me. It's evidence from a closed case." The man beside her tensed. His grip on the knife tightened. "A closed case?" Selma repeated, emboldened by the man's defiance. "The one where you burned a man alive?" The sheriff's friendly mask dropped. His face hardened into a cruel granite slab. "He was a criminal. He resisted arrest. The fire was an unfortunate accident." "Liar!" the man beside her rasped. The word was a blade of its own, sharp and full of hate. The sheriff laughed, a short, ugly bark. "Still got some fight in you, do you, Kane? I thought I'd burned it all out of you." Kane. So he had a name. You left him for dead, Selma accused, the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place with sickening speed. You set that fire to destroy whatever is in that bag. You thought he was dead, but he survived. And when he stumbled into your town, you couldn't just kill him in plain sight. So you put him in a cage. You called him a beast to discredit him, hoping he'd just waste away. Clever girl, the sheriff said with a smirk. Maybe I should hire you. He took a step closer. Here's how this is going to go. You're going to slide that bag over here. Then you and the lady are going to walk away. I might even let you live. A reward for bringing him to me. Selma looked at Kane. His eyes were blazing with a cold fire. He gave the slightest shake of his head. He would die before he gave up that bag. And that ring you gave me, the sheriff added, his voice full of venomous glee. He pulled it from his pocket and held it up. My predecessor, Sheriff Albright, was a sentimental fool, had his wife's initials engraved inside. The same Sheriff Albright that this man, he pointed the rifle at Kane, murdered in cold blood. Your ring is the final piece of evidence I need to see him hang. You didn't just buy him, sweetheart. You bought the rope for his neck. The world tilted under Selma's feet. The ring, her husband's ring, which she had treasured. It had been Albright's wife's? How? Had her husband found it? Bought it? The questions swirled, but one terrible fact remained. In her desperate act of compassion, she had handed this monster the very weapon he needed to finish the job. She had doomed the man she tried to save. Despair washed over her, cold and numbing. It was over. They were trapped. But Kane wasn't looking at the sheriff. He was looking at the ground beside the broken wagon wheel. He was looking at the greasy, dirt-caked splint he had fashioned. His eyes narrowed. Then everything happened at once. With a guttural roar, Kane lunged, not at the sheriff, but at the broken wheel. He kicked the supporting rock out from under it. The heavy wagon, laden with all of Selma's worldly possessions, groaned, and then crashed down with the force of a falling tree. It was a diversion. A split second of chaos. The sheriff flinched, his rifle wavering for an instant. It was all the time Kane needed. He wasn't moving toward them. He was moving away, sprinting for the darkness of the sheer rock face of the mesa. Get him! The sheriff screamed at his deputy. The deputy, startled into action, raised his pistol and fired. The shot echoed through the canyon like a thunderclap. Kane cried out, a raw, pained sound, and stumbled, but he kept moving. He scrambled up the rocks, agile as a mountain goat, and vanished into the shadows. Idiot! The sheriff roared, turning on his deputy. You were supposed to hit him! The sheriff turned his furious gaze back to Selma, who was frozen in terror behind the wagon. He won't get far, not with a bullet in him. He started walking toward her, his face a mask of rage. But you and I are going to have a little talk. Selma backed away, her heart pounding. She was alone now. Kane was gone, wounded, maybe dying, and the monster who had orchestrated it all was coming for her. She had nothing. No weapon, no hope. Her hand brushed against something on the wagon's frame. It was a length of heavy chain she used for securing loads. Her fingers wrapped around the cold, heavy links. It wasn't much, but it was something. As the sheriff rounded the edge of the wagon, a triumphant, cruel smile on his face, Selma swung the chain with all the strength she had. The night exploded into violence. The heavy chain connected with the side of the sheriff's head with a sickening crunch. He staggered back, surprise and pain warring on his face, his rifle discharging into the dirt. He hadn't expected her to fight back. No one ever did. You witch! He snarled, raising the rifle butt to strike her. But the deputy was on her now, grabbing her from behind, pinning her arms. The chain fell from her grasp. She struggled, kicked, but he was too strong. The sheriff advanced on her, his eyes full of murder. This was it. This was the end of the road. Suddenly, a rock the size of a fist flew out of the darkness and struck the deputy squarely in the temple. He grunted and collapsed, releasing Selma. She stumbled forward, catching her breath, and looked up toward the mesa. There, Silhouetted against the night sky was Kane. He was leaning heavily against a boulder, one hand pressed to his side where the bullet had hit him. But in his other hand, he held another rock. He wasn't running. He was fighting. He had drawn them away from the wagon on purpose, creating a battlefield of his own choosing. "You stubborn fool!" the sheriff screamed up at him, forgetting all about Selma for the moment. He raised his rifle and fired again. The bullet sparked off the rock near Kane's head. Kane didn't flinch. He just hurled the second rock. It was a desperate long-range attack, but it showed his intent. He would not be taken. He would die on this mountain, under the stars, fighting for whatever secret he protected in that bag. The sheriff, enraged, began scrambling up the rocks after him, firing as he went. "I'll kill you myself! I'll gut you and leave you for the vultures!" Selma was on the ground, her mind racing. The wagon. Kane had kicked the support from the wheel. Why? It wasn't just a diversion. He had looked at the greasy splint. What had he seen? She crawled over to the broken wheel. Her hands scrabbled in the dirt and grease. What was she even looking for? Her fingers closed around something small, hard and metallic, hidden in the thick axle grease where he had been working. She pulled it out and wiped it clean on her sleeve. It was a firing pin. Small, perfectly machined steel. She looked at the saddlebag, lying in the dirt where Kane had dropped it when he ran. She scrambled over to it, her hands shaking, and fumbled with the buckle. She ripped it open and plunged her hand inside. Her fingers brushed against a leather-bound book, papers, and then the cold, heavy weight of a pistol. She pulled it out. It was a Colt Peacemaker, beautifully maintained but inert. Useless. She remembered what she'd seen him do that first night, taking something from his pack. He wasn't just checking on a secret. He was hiding the heart of his weapon. He knew this was coming. He had been preparing. She jammed the firing pin into its slot at the back of the revolver. It clicked into place. The gun was alive now, heavy, real. Above her, on the dark slopes of the mesa, she heard a cry of pain, followed by the sheriff's triumphant laughter. Kane was weakening. He couldn't last much longer. Selma had never fired a gun in her life. Her husband had tried to teach her once, but she'd hated the noise, the kick, the smell of burnt powder. But this was different. This wasn't about sport or practice. This was about justice. This was about the choice she had made in the town square. She stood up, the heavy Colt feeling surprisingly steady in her two hands. She took a deep breath, aimed at the sky, and pulled the trigger. The explosion was deafening. The recoil slammed her shoulders. The shot was wild, nowhere near the fighting men above, but it didn't matter. It was a signal. On the mountain, the sheriff's laughter died. He looked down, his eyes wide with disbelief, seeing the woman he'd dismissed as a helpless widow now armed and dangerous. In that moment of distraction, Kane acted. He surged forward, not with a rock, but with the full weight of his body, tackling the sheriff in a desperate final gambit. The two men tumbled together, a chaotic knot of limbs and curses rolling down the rocky slope. They crashed to the ground at the base of the mesa, not far from where Selma stood. The sheriff's rifle had flown from his grasp. Kane's knife was gone. They were just two men, fighting with their bare hands in the dirt. The sheriff was bigger, stronger, fueled by rage. Kane was wounded, exhausted, but driven by something more powerful. He fought with a cold, desperate fury. Selma could see the raw, red stain spreading across his shirt. He was losing blood fast. The sheriff gained the upper hand. He pinned Kane to the ground, his thick fingers wrapping around Kane's throat, the same throat he had already tried to destroy once before. Kane's face began to turn purple, his struggles weakening. "I should have finished the job in that cabin," the sheriff hissed, his face inches from Kane's. "This time, I'll watch the life go out of your eyes." Selma raised the pistol again. Her hands were shaking violently now. She couldn't risk a shot. They were too close, a tangled mess of motion. If she missed, she could hit Kane. She had to do something. She looked at the saddlebag, the evidence, the reason for all of this death and desperation. She ran to it, tore it open, and pulled out the leather-bound book. She opened it. It was a ledger, page after page of names, dates, and figures. A detailed record of bribery, extortion, and murder, all signed at the bottom of each page with the name of the land baron who owned half the territory and the sheriff of Fallow Ridge. This was the secret. This was the soul he was guarding. "Stop!" Selma screamed, her voice cracking. "I have the ledger! It's over!" The sheriff looked up, his eyes wild. He saw the book in her hands. He saw his whole corrupt world about to come crashing down. He let go of Kane's throat and scrambled to his feet. "That book dies with you," he snarled, and charged at her. He was a terrifying sight, a mountain of a man moving with murderous intent. Selma stood her ground, the heavy book in one hand, the heavy pistol in the other. She knew she only had one shot. She didn't aim for his chest. She aimed for his leg. She squeezed the trigger. The gun roared. The sheriff screamed, a high, thin sound of agony, and crumpled to the ground, clutching his shattered knee. He writhed in the dirt, his reign of terror ending not with a bang, but with a pathetic, whimpering cry. Silence fell over the canyon. The only sounds were the sheriff's moans, the wind, and Selma's own ragged breathing. She walked over to where Kane lay on the ground. He was conscious, barely. He was looking at her, his eyes full of 1,000 things he couldn't say. Gratitude, awe, shock. He reached a trembling hand, not for his wound, not for a weapon, but for the ledger she still held. She knelt beside him and placed it in his hand. His fingers closed around it, a look of profound relief washing over his battered face. He had done it. His mission was complete. Selma looked from the wounded man at her feet to the groaning sheriff, to the unconscious deputy, and then at the pistol still smoking in her hand. The woman who had left her home a few weeks ago, a grieving widow running from her past, was gone. In her place was someone else. Someone forged in the fire of Fallow Ridge and the crucible of this dark canyon. She didn't know who she was yet, but she knew one thing for sure. She was no longer afraid of the dark. They left the sheriff and his deputy tied up with the same length of chain Selma had used as a weapon. She left a note tucked into the sheriff's vest, addressed to the nearest U.S. Marshal's office, explaining everything and detailing the location of the ledger. She propped the wounded men up against a rock, leaving them a canteen of water. Justice would find them. Their brand of it anyway. Her concern was for Kane. The bullet had gone clean through the fleshy part of his side. It was painful, bleeding badly, but it hadn't hit anything vital. At least she prayed it hadn't. She tore strips from her own petticoat to bandage the wound, her hands surprisingly steady. He sat stoically, his back against the wagon wheel, watching her with those intense, silent eyes. She had saved his life. He had saved hers. They were bound together now, not by a ring or a transaction, but by blood and gunpowder. She helped him into the back of the wagon, making him as comfortable as she could on a bed of blankets. He was weak from blood loss, his face pale and drawn in the pre-dawn light. The saddlebag, his sacred trust, lay beside him. Its secrets were no longer a mystery, but the weight of it seemed heavier than ever. As the sun began to rise, painting the eastern sky in shades of rose and gold, Selma took up the reins. The old horse, sensing the shift in command, seemed to accept her authority without protest. She guided the wagon out of the Canyon of Ghosts and back onto the eastward trail. For 2 days, they traveled in a different kind of silence. It was no longer a silence of suspicion and secrets, but one of healing and exhaustion. Selma drove, her mind a whirlwind of the past night's events, the crack of the chain, the roar of the pistol, the look in the sheriff's eyes. She felt like she had aged 10 years in a single night. Kane drifted in and out of a feverish sleep in the back of the wagon. When he was awake, he would watch her, a quiet intensity in his gaze. He never tried to speak. The effort was too much, his throat too damaged. But he didn't need to. His eyes spoke volumes. On the 3rd day, his fever broke. He was able to sit up and take some broth she'd made from boiled roots and salt pork. She was cleaning his wound, applying a fresh bandage when his hand shot out and grabbed her wrist. His grip was gentle, but firm. He held her gaze, his expression serious. Then he reached for the saddlebag. He pulled out the ledger and pushed it toward her. She shook her head. "No, that's yours, your burden," he insisted, nudging it into her lap. Then he opened his mouth and pointed to his scarred throat. He made a writing motion with his hand. He wanted her to read it to him. He wanted her to be his voice. Selma's throat felt tight with emotion. She opened the heavy book. The first page wasn't numbers and names. It was a letter, written in a strong, clear hand. To whoever finds this, it began. "My name is Marshal James Kane. I was sent to the Blackwood Territory to investigate rumors of corruption surrounding Land Baron Tiberius Crow and his hired lawman, Sheriff Brand. My partner, Sheriff Samuel Albright of Fallow Ridge, had been gathering evidence against them for months. He discovered that Crow was using Brand to intimidate, murder, and illegally dispossess homesteaders of their rightful claims, forging new deeds to absorb their land into his own vast holdings." Selma stopped, her breath catching. Land deeds, forged. The piece of paper that had sent her on this journey, the deed to her husband's homestead, could it be one of them? She forced herself to keep reading. Albright had compiled his findings in this ledger. He arranged a meeting with me to hand it over. But Crow and Brand found out. They ambushed us at Albright's cabin. They murdered him. They set the cabin on fire to destroy the ledger, and they shot me in the throat and left me for dead when I tried to stop them. I survived. I recovered the ledger from the flames. My mission is to deliver this proof, and the news of his death, to Sheriff Albright's widow, who lives on their homestead just east of Serpent's Canyon. The book fell from Selma's trembling hands. Serpent's Canyon. That was where she was going. The homestead her husband had bought, the one she was traveling to, it was Sheriff Albright's. Her husband hadn't claimed it. He had bought a forged deed from the very men who had murdered its rightful owner. Her entire journey was a lie, built on the foundation of a crime. Kane was watching her, his eyes full of a shared, tragic understanding. He knew. He had probably known from the moment she'd told him where she was headed. Her destination and his mission were the same. Two broken people, drawn to the same place by two different ghosts. She looked at him, at his battered face, his wounded side, the scars on his throat. He had endured hell to complete his mission, to bring justice and peace to a grieving widow, a widow who would never receive it. Because Sheriff Albright's widow was already dead. Selma remembered the gossip from the last town she'd passed through, the sad story of the sheriff's wife who had died of a broken heart a year ago, waiting for a husband who never came home. "She's not there, Kane," Selma whispered, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "The widow. She's gone. She died last winter." A look of utter devastation crossed Kane's face. The one purpose that had driven him through fire and torment, the one goal that had kept him alive, was gone. His mission had failed. He had nothing left. He closed his eyes, his body slumping in defeat, a man hollowed out by fate. Selma wanted to comfort him, to tell him it wasn't his fault. But what could she say? They were two lost souls in a sea of lies, their destination a monument to a grief that could never be healed. But as she looked at the ledger, at the proof of so much evil, a new feeling began to smolder in the ashes of her despair. Anger. A cold, hard anger. Tiberius Crow, the land baron, the man at the top of it all. He had taken Albright's life, Kane's voice, and her future. He was still out there, sitting on a throne of stolen land and buried bodies. The mission wasn't over. She picked up the ledger and met Kane's weary gaze. Her own eyes were clear and hard as diamonds. "Then we'll just have to find a new purpose for this book," she said, her voice low and dangerous. "And a new destination for our journey." They reached the homestead at the edge of Serpent's Canyon 2 days later. It was just as she'd imagined, and 100 times worse. The cabin was small but well built. nestled in a grove of cottonwood trees by a clear, fast-running creek, a testament to a life that had been brutally cut short. The front porch swing creaked in the wind, moving back and forth like a ghost still waiting. The sight of it should have broken them both. It was the end of his mission, the end of her journey, a place of ghosts and dead ends. But it didn't feel like an ending. It felt like a crossroads. Cain, leaning heavily on a walking stick he'd carved, surveyed the quiet homestead. The devastation was still clear in his eyes, but beneath it, something else was taking root. A resolve. He looked at Selma, a question in his eyes. What now? Now, Selma said, her voice firm, we rest, we heal, and then we finish what you and Sheriff Albright started. For a week, they lived in a strange, suspended peace. Selma aired out the cabin, chasing away the dust and the stale air of grief. She found a small, lovingly tended garden behind the house, now overgrown with weeds. She began to work it, pulling the weeds with a vengeance, finding a strange solace in the feel of the earth under her fingernails. Cain, meanwhile, healed. His wound slowly began to close, the color returning to his face. He was still silent, the damage to his throat too severe for easy speech. But he communicated in other ways. He repaired the broken porch steps. He reinforced the corral fence. He would watch her work in the garden, and in the evenings, he would sit on the porch and carve. He carved small, intricate figures. A hawk, a running horse, a woman with a long braid, her hands sunk into the earth. One evening, as the sun set, casting long shadows across the valley, Selma sat on the porch steps, the ledger in her lap. She had read it cover to cover a dozen times. It was a meticulous, damning account of Tiberius Crow's empire of greed. Cain came and sat beside her. He looked at the book, then at her. He tapped his chest, then pointed to the ledger, and then pointed down the road, west, back toward the heart of the territory. Back toward Crow. Selma knew what he was asking. It was his duty. He had to see it through. You can't go alone, she said. You're not healed, and they'll be looking for you, for both of us. He shrugged, a stubborn set to his jaw. It didn't matter. It was a matter of honor. No, Selma said, her voice quiet but unyielding. She closed the ledger. This isn't just your fight anymore. Crow didn't just take Albright's life and your voice. He sold my husband a lie. He built his fortune on the backs of people like us. This book, it's our justice, not just yours. She stood up and faced him. When you're strong enough, we'll go together. We'll take this to the territorial governor in the capital. We won't let them bury this story. A flicker of surprise, then something akin to gratitude, shone in his eyes. He gave a slow, solemn nod. An agreement, a pact. That night, something shifted between them. The space on the porch seemed smaller. The silence was no longer a void, but a shared understanding. As she was about to go inside, he held up his hand, asking her to wait. He disappeared into the cabin and came back a moment later holding something. It was one of his carvings, a small, perfect star, carved from the light-colored ironwood he'd used for the wagon splint, a marshal's badge. He held it out to her. She took it, the wood smooth and warm in her palm. Then he did something that made her heart stop. He gently took the end of her long braid, the one she had let grow as a sign of mourning for her husband. With his calloused, surprisingly nimble fingers, he began to unbraid it. He combed it out with his fingers, smoothing the tangles. Then, slowly, reverently, he began to braid it again. It was a thick, strong plait, woven with a sureness that spoke of long practice. When he reached the end, he didn't tie it off with her simple leather thong. He took a thin strip of rawhide and carefully, securely, tied the wooden star into her hair. He was making her a part of his law, his quest. She raised a trembling hand to touch it. The star was solid, real, a promise. She looked at him, and for the first time she saw not the beast from the cage, not the wounded marshal, but just a man, Cain. And in his eyes, she saw her own reflection. They were no longer two separate people, adrift and alone. Their stories, their grief, and their futures were now braided together, as tight and as strong as the hair down her back. And together, they were going to bring a reckoning. The calm lasted for 2 weeks. It was a fragile, borrowed peace, and they both knew it. While Kane's body healed, his mind was sharp, planning, preparing. He spent hours with the ledger, pointing out names and locations to Selma, drawing maps in the dirt. He was teaching her, training her. They were no longer a widow and a vagrant. They were a conspiracy. Selma, in turn, found a strength she never knew she possessed. The garden flourished under her care. She learned to shoot the colt, practicing for hours down by the creek, until she could hit a tin can from 30 paces. The kick of the gun no longer scared her. It felt like power. It felt like hope. The wooden star Kane had tied into her hair was a constant comforting weight. It was a reminder of their purpose, their pact. The peace shattered on a Tuesday. Selma was coming up from the creek, her arms full of laundry, when she saw the dust cloud on the horizon. It wasn't a lone rider. It was a group, at least 5 of them. They were riding hard, coming straight for the homestead. She dropped the laundry and ran for the cabin. "Kane!" He was already on the porch, rifle in hand. He'd seen them too. There was no surprise on his face, only a grim certainty. Tiberius Crow had found them. The captured sheriff must have talked. "Inside," he rasped, pushing her toward the door. "Bar the windows." They worked in a frantic, silent ballet. Selma barred the heavy shutters over the windows, plunging the cabin into a dim, fortified twilight. Kane checked his weapons, the rifle, the Colt, the bone-handled knife. He handed Selma the pistol. Their eyes met across the gloomy room. There was no fear in his gaze, only a fight that had been a long time coming. The riders thundered into the yard and surrounded the cabin. A man on a fine black horse, a big man with a florid face and expensive clothes, rode to the front. It had to be Crow. "Marshal Kane," he boomed, his voice oozing false authority. "I have a warrant for your arrest, for the murder of Sheriff Brand of Fallow Ridge. Come out with your hands up, and the woman won't be harmed." Kane let out a short, contemptuous, silent laugh. "We know you have the ledger," Crow shouted, his voice losing its pleasant tone. "Give it to me, and I'll make your death quick." Selma looked at the heavy leather book sitting on the table, the source of all this trouble. It felt like it was pulsing with a dark energy. Kane moved to the window, peering through a small crack in the shutter. He raised his rifle. He wasn't going to surrender. He was going to make his stand here, in the home of the man he'd failed to save. "This is your only warning," Crow yelled. "Come out or we burn you out." It was happening again. Fire. Crow's preferred method of erasing his problems. But Kane had learned from the last fire. He pointed to the stone fireplace and the heavy water barrels beside it. Then he looked at Selma, a question in his eyes. "Are you ready?" She gripped the Colt, her knuckles white. She nodded. "So be it," Crow snarled. One of his men rode forward, a lit torch in his hand. He tossed it onto the dry wood of the porch roof. The flames caught instantly, smoke beginning to billow. The siege had begun. The first shot came from Kane. He fired through the shutter and one of Crow's men screamed and fell from his horse. The yard erupted into a chaos of gunfire. Bullets thudded into the thick log walls of the cabin. The roar was deafening. Selma huddled by the back window, the Colt clutched in her hands. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. This was insane. They were hopelessly outnumbered. But Kane was a force of nature. He moved from window to window, a grim, silent specter of vengeance. He never wasted a shot. For every one he fired, a cry of pain answered from outside. He was a master of siege warfare, using the cabin's defenses to their fullest. But the fire on the roof was spreading, and smoke was beginning to fill the room, stinging their eyes and choking their lungs. One of Crow's men tried to break down the door. A single shot from Kane's rifle sent him sprawling into the dirt. But they were relentless. 2 more men rushed the porch, using a heavy log as a battering ram. The door splintered. Kane shoved a heavy table in front of it, but he knew it wouldn't hold. He looked at Selma, his face grimed with smoke. He pointed to the back of the cabin, then to the horse, already saddled in the corral. He wanted her to run, to take the ledger and run. Selma shook her head, her eyes blazing with defiance. She looked at the braid over her shoulder, at the wooden star tied into its end. She wasn't leaving him. They had made a pact. She fired the Colt through the back window, forcing one of the gunmen who was circling the house to dive for cover. "I'm not running!" she yelled over the din. A look of fierce pride flashed in Kane's eyes. The front door burst open. Two of Crow's thugs spilled into the room, pistols firing. Kane dropped one with the rifle, but the other one was on him, tackling him to the ground. They wrestled for the rifle, a desperate, grunting struggle in the smoke-filled room. Selma didn't hesitate. She turned and fired the Colt. The gunman who was on top of Kane stiffened and then collapsed. Kane scrambled to his feet, grabbing his rifle. But outside, Crow was laughing. "It's over, Kane. The house is surrounded. You're breathing your last breath." The roof groaned above them. Flames were starting to lick down the inside walls. They were trapped in a burning box. Kane looked around frantically. His eyes landed on the stone fireplace. It was huge, built to heat the cabin through the harsh winters. The chimney was wide. He looked up the dark, smoky flue, then looked at Selma. An idea, desperate and insane, was forming on his face. He grabbed the ledger from the table and shoved it into his saddlebag. He slung it over his shoulder. He pointed up the chimney. "Climb," he rasped, his voice raw. Selma looked at the dark, soot-choked opening. It was madness, but the alternative was to burn alive or be shot. She holstered the Colt and started to climb, finding handholds in the rough stone. Kane was right behind her, boosting her up. The chimney was narrow, rough, and filled with choking smoke. Soot rained down on them. Her lungs burned. Her fingers were raw, but she kept climbing, pulling herself up into the darkness, toward a patch of gray sky far above. She heard Crow's men burst into the room below them, just as her hands found the top of the chimney. With a final desperate heave, she pulled herself onto the roof. The world was a dizzying vortex of flame and smoke. The entire roof was a sea of fire, except for the small stone island of the chimney stack. Kane emerged a second later, coughing, his face black with soot. They were exposed, trapped. Below them, Crow looked up, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. "Kill them!" he roared. "Shoot them off that roof!" Bullets zipped past them, chipping stone from the chimney. They were pinned down, with nowhere to go but back into the fire. It was over. But Kane wasn't looking down at Crow. He was looking at the huge cottonwood tree whose branches overhung the cabin. One thick branch, a limb as wide as a man's waist, was just a few feet from the chimney. It was a terrifying leap over a sea of fire with a 20-foot drop to the ground. Kane looked at Selma. His eyes were not asking. They were telling her. This was their only way out. He would jump first. She had to follow. He took a deep breath, crouched, and then launched himself into the air. For a heart-stopping second, he hung suspended against the fiery backdrop, a dark angel in flight. He hit the branch hard, his arms wrapping around it, his legs dangling over the abyss. He clung on, then scrambled to a more secure position. He turned back to her, his hand outstretched. "Selma!" he coughed, his voice a desperate plea. "Jump!" Selma looked at the fire, at the leering faces of the men below, at the impossible gap. Her fear was a physical thing, a cold hand gripping her heart. She couldn't do it. Then her hand went to the braid, to the wooden star. It was a promise, a pact. She closed her eyes, took a breath that was more smoke than air, and she jumped. The fall felt like it lasted an eternity. The heat of the fire blasted her back. She thought she had missed, that she was going to plummet to the ground. But then her hand was caught in a grip of iron. Kane. He held her, his arms straining, his face a mask of grim determination. He pulled her up onto the branch beside him. They were safe. For a moment. They scrambled down the tree, dropping the last 10 feet to the ground behind the cabin. They landed hard, the air knocked from their lungs. The corral was just ahead. The horse, terrified by the fire and gunfire, was bucking and rearing. "The horse!" Selma gasped. They ran. Crow's men, realizing what had happened, were circling the burning cabin. They would be on them in seconds. Kane reached the corral first. He vaulted the fence, speaking to the horse in a low, calming tone that Selma couldn't hear. The animal, recognizing his voice, miraculously quieted. Kane swung himself into the saddle, then reached down for Selma. He pulled her up behind him just as the first of Crow's men rounded the corner of the cabin. "There they are!" Kane didn't hesitate. He spurred the horse, and the powerful animal leaped the corral fence, landing on the other side and bolting for the open country. Bullets whistled past their ears. Selma clung to Kane, burying her face in his back, the saddlebag with the precious ledger bouncing between them. They rode like the wind, leaving the burning homestead, the ghosts, and Tiberius Crow's rage behind them. They were alive. They were free. And they had the one thing that could burn Crow's entire empire to the ground. They didn't look back. There was nothing left for them there. Their future was ahead, on a long, dangerous road to the territorial capital, and they would ride it together. The road to the capital was 150 miles of unforgiving terrain. They rode hard, pushing the horse, pushing themselves. They knew Crow would not give up. He would send every man he had after them. The ledger was his death warrant, and he knew it. They rode by night and hid by day, sleeping in cold caves and dense thickets. They ate what they could hunt and forage, their hunger a constant gnawing ache. But they were alive, and they were together. The hardship forged them, melting away the last of the strangers they had been, leaving only a man and a woman bound by a single, unwavering purpose. During those long days in hiding, Kane taught Selma everything he knew. How to read the land, how to track, how to cover their trail. He would draw in the dirt with a stick, explaining tactics, ambush points, survival tricks. He was still mostly silent, his voice a painful, rasping whisper he saved for only the most essential words. But his hands, his eyes, the drawings in the dirt, they spoke a language she now understood perfectly. One afternoon, hiding in a rocky outcropping that overlooked the trail, he took the bone-handled knife and began to carve. Selma watched him, her head resting on his shoulder. He wasn't carving an animal this time. He was carving a small, simple ring. When he was done, he handed it to her. It was made from the dark, rich wood of a walnut branch. She slipped it onto her finger. It fit perfectly. It wasn't a replacement for the gold band she had traded for his life. It was something new. Something that belonged to this life, not the one before. She looked at him, her heart full. "Thank you," she whispered. He just smiled, a rare, small thing that lit up his tired face. He touched the wooden ring on her finger, then he touched the wooden star in her hair. His, hers, theirs. They were 10 miles from the capital when Crow's men finally caught up to them. There were 3 of them, hard-faced killers who had tracked them with a relentless skill. They cornered them in a dry riverbed, a natural trap with steep walls on 3 sides. "Nowhere left to run, Marshal," the leader sneered, his pistol aimed at Kane's chest. But Kane had chosen this spot. He had seen them coming. He had prepared. He shoved Selma behind a large boulder. "Stay down," he rasped. Then he stood, facing the 3 men alone, the setting sun at his back, making him a dark, imposing silhouette. He held the Colt in his hand. "The book, Kane," the leader said. "Give us the book and we'll let the woman live." Kane didn't answer. He just stood his ground, his eyes cold and steady. "Have it your way," the man snarled. The world exploded in a final desperate battle. Gunshots echoed off the canyon walls. Selma, peering from behind the rock, saw Kane move with a deadly grace. He wasn't the wounded man from the Homestead siege. He was a marshal of the United States, a bringer of justice, and this was his reckoning. He shot the leader first, a clean shot to the chest. The other two opened fire, and Kane dived for cover, bullets kicking up dust around him. One of the men charged his position. Selma saw her chance. She rose up from behind her own rock and fired the other pistol, the one Kane had given her. The shot went wide, but it made the second man flinch, turning his attention to her for a fatal second. It was all the time Kane needed. He emerged from cover and fired. The second man fell. The last gunman, seeing he was beaten, turned to run. "No," Kane whispered. He took careful aim and shot the man in the leg, the same way Selma had shot the sheriff. An eye for an eye. Justice, not just vengeance. It was over. They rode into the capital the next day, weary, battered, but victorious. They walked up the steps of the territorial governor's mansion, two unlikely figures in dusty, trail-worn clothes. The guards tried to stop them, but Kane simply held up the star badge he had taken back from the evidence locker, his badge, and they stepped aside. The governor, a portly man with a skeptical face, listened to their incredible story with growing alarm. When Selma opened the ledger on his polished desk, his face went pale. He saw the names. He saw the proof. He saw the signature of Tiberius Crow, a man he had dinner with just last week. By the end of the day, the territory was in an uproar. Warrants were issued. Tiberius Crow and his entire criminal enterprise were arrested. The story of the silent marshal and the brave widow who had brought him down was on everyone's lips. Weeks later, their work was done. The corrupt were brought to justice. The stolen lands were being returned to their rightful owners, or what was left of them. Selma and Kane stood on a hill overlooking the bustling capital. Their journey was over. They were free to go their separate ways. "What will you do now?" Selma asked, looking at him. Kane looked out at the horizon. The Marshal Service had offered him his badge back, a promotion, a new post, a hero's reward. He shook his head. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a piece of paper. It was a deed, a clean one, legally signed by the governor, the deed to the Albright homestead. It was in Selma's name. She looked at it, then at him, her eyes filling with tears. "You don't have to," she started. "You could—" He put a finger to her lips, silencing her. Then he whispered, his voice still a rough, broken thing, but clearer now, stronger. "My mission is over. My home is with you." He took her hand, the one with the wooden ring, and squeezed it. Selma looked at the man beside her, the man she had bought with a ring, the man who had been called a beast, the man who had lost his voice but had spoken volumes with his courage and his heart. She thought of the journey they had taken, the fires they had walked through. She thought of the braid down her back, with its wooden star, a symbol of their shared fight. She hadn't traded her ring for a broken man. She had traded it for a new life, a new beginning, a love story that was not written in words, but in scars, in shared glances, and in the silent, unbreakable promise of a shared future. Together they turned away from the capital and started on the long road back to the small cabin by the creek. They were going home. If you were moved by Selma and Kane's journey for justice, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell for more stories that dig deep into the heart of the Old West. We all face moments where we have to make a choice. What's the biggest risk you've ever taken for a stranger? Let us know in the comments below.